Okay, so now let us start with SA 610 using the work of internal auditors. So this standard deals with using the work of the internal audit function, or basically the internal audit department. So before getting into the main essay, let us understand what this internal audit function is. So we all know that company has two levels, TCGG and management. So TCGG is responsible for oversight of the financial reporting process, and management is responsible for the preparation and presentation of financial statements and design, implementation and maintenance of internal control. So management has a department known as internal audit department. So this department is a management function. Okay, so this department can be outsourced as well. So the internal audit department gives guidance on the risk management, governance and internal control. So what relationship does the internal audit department have with the external auditor? So we all know that the external auditor is responsible for giving the opinion on the financial statements. So SA 610 talks about the relationship between the external auditor and the internal auditor. So how the external auditor will use the work of internal auditor, in what cases will he use the work, in what cases will he use less work. So what are the different objectives under this essay? So let us discuss them. Okay, so first and foremost, let us understand the meaning of internal audit function. So internal audit function is a function of the entity that performs assurance and consulting activities to improve the effectiveness of the entity's governance, risk management and internal control process. So the internal audit function, it's basically a department within the entity that improves the effectiveness of the entity regarding governance, risk management and internal control process by giving assurance and consulting activities. Now assurance means it gives an opinion on internal control. So we know that the external auditor is not responsible for giving an opinion on the internal control. He just has to understand the internal control. But the internal auditor, that is the internal audit function, the entire department will give assurance to the management that your internal control is functioning well. It gives opinion on the internal control. And it also gives consulting activities, that is suggestions to improve. So there is an important MCQ over here if you take a look. Which of the following is not the functions of internal auditor of an organization? Performing assurance activities, performing consulting activities to improve governance of organization, performing risk management activities, or expressing independent opinion on financial statements. So internal auditor can never express independent opinion on the financial statement. Okay, so this is the wrong one. So just from the first definition part only, we are able to solve an MCQ. So we don't know from which part, which nook and corner of the essay they are going to test us. So we need to understand the entire essay properly. So this was about the meaning of internal audit function. Next, let us understand the objective and scope of internal audit. So basically, objective and scope of internal audit also deals with these three main functions, that is governance, risk management and internal control process. So the activities relating to these are only our objective scope of internal audit. So first and foremost, governance. So the internal auditor will assess the governance process in its accomplishment of objectives. So basically, the management or the management needs to govern the entity's functions properly. So the internal auditor will assess the governance process in its accomplishment of objectives, whether the governance process that you have designed is able to accomplish its objectives or not. So what are those specific objectives? Ethics and values, performance management and accountability, and communication of risk to appropriate areas of management. So whether the governance process is functioning properly or not, that is the first objective of the internal audit department. Next, we have risk management. So it assists the management by identifying and assessing significant risks. So this red color star means significant. Okay, so it assesses the management by identifying and assessing the significant risk, and also it helps in improving the risk management and internal control. So this is the second objective. Then the third one that we have is internal control process. So under this we have a lot of small sub points. Okay, so let us understand each one of them. The first one is evaluation of internal control. So internal control process, internal audit department will help the entity to improve effectiveness of the entity's internal control process. So internal control process के effectiveness को improve करने के लिए first and foremost the internal audit department will evaluate the internal control. It will review the controls, it will evaluate the operations, and it will recommend the areas for improvement. Then it will examine financial and operating information like how the entity is identifying, recognizing, classifying, reporting its financial and operational data. How is the entity identifying them? How is the entity recognizing them in the books of accounts? How is the entity classifying them? And finally, how is the entity reporting them? That is part of internal control. And next, we have review of operating activities. So whatever operating activities are there, how efficiently and effectively are you carrying them out? So operating activities include non-financial activities as well. Okay. Next, are you complying with law or regulations? So the internal control process, the internal auditor will evaluate the internal control process and you'll also review whether you are complying with law or regulations or not. So these are the objective and scope of internal audit. Okay. Next, so the external auditor wants to use the internal auditor's work. So in what way can the external auditor use the internal auditor's work? So the external auditor can use the internal auditor's work for risk assessment. He can gather information that is relevant to evaluating the risk of middle misstatement. Then he can use the internal auditor's work as audit evidence. He can consider internal auditor's work as part of audit evidence following legal and regulatory guidelines. Then he can also employ internal auditors under external auditors. The external auditor can employ internal auditors under his oversight. So he can take direct assistance. He can give direct assistance to them. Okay. He can give direct assistance to them and obtain information from them. Okay. So always remember one thing. The external auditor is using the internal auditor's work. But because of this, he does not require to modify nature, extent and timing of audit procedures. Just because I am using internal auditor's work, I shouldn't change my audit procedures. Okay. So using internal auditor's work does not require external auditor to modify nature, extent and timing of audit procedures to be performed. It remains a decision of the auditor. So it may change in different scenarios because all entities are not the same. Some might be complex, some might be simple, short entities, small entities. So it remains a decision of the auditor. It remains the auditor's professional judgment. Okay. So what is the external auditor's responsibility for audit? So the external auditor has a sole responsibility for the audit. He is alone responsible for the audit opinion, and this responsibility is not reduced by using the internal audit function direct assistance. Just because I'm using direct assistance, just because I'm using the internal audit function, just because I'm using the internal department's work, it does not reduce my responsibility for the audit opinion. I am solely responsible for giving an opinion on the financial statements. Okay. Internal auditors are not independent as required by SA 200. Internal auditors are nowhere independent. Okay. So they are not independent as required by SA 200. And the work of internal auditor can be used but only subject to the conditions specified in SA 610. So SA 610 talks about when you can use the internal auditor's work if you satisfy a few conditions, and those conditions are what which are being specified, which are being elaborated in under this essay. So what are the objectives of the auditor? So this is a very important part. So every essay, the objectives of auditor is very, very important. So just like that for essay 610, what are the objectives of auditor as per essay 610? This is the most favorite question, a very important area in this chapter. First and foremost, the objective of the auditor is to determine usability. Determine whether the work of the internal audit function or direct assistance from internal auditors can be utilized, and if so, in what areas and to what extent. First, determine whether it can be used. Then check in what areas you can use them and to what extent. Okay. Next, assess adequacy of internal audit functions work. So the internal audit functions work should be adequate. If it is not adequate, if it is incomplete, then what's the point of using it? Okay. Next, direct, supervise and review. If using internal auditors to provide direct assistance, then direct supervise work of internal auditors. So basically, if you're taking their, if you're using their assistance, then direct supervise and review them, because you are the external auditor. You need to obtain information from them, and if they are under your guidance, then just check whether they are doing the work properly. Give them some guidance, direct supervise and review their work. Okay. Next, using the work of internal audit function. Now, our first objective is determine the usability. Determine whether the work of the internal audit function can be used or not. So after that, the first thing you need to understand is if you're using the work, in what areas and to what extent. And now you will start with the three main steps. First, you'll evaluate the internal audit function. Then you'll determine the nature and extent of work of internal function that can be used, and using the work of internal audit function. First, evaluate the internal audit function. Second, determine the nature and extent of work that can be used. And third thing, you're using the work. So these three are only the main points over here. point 1, point 2, and point 3. First, you need to evaluate the internal audit function. Second, you need to determine the nature and extent of internal audit function that can be used, and using the work of internal audit function. So these three are the major points. So first, let us understand what is the meaning of evaluating. So what evaluations will external auditor do to determine whether the work of internal auditor can be used for the purposes of audit? So there are mainly three evaluations. You need to evaluate the internal auditor's objectivity, his competence, whether he is applying a systematic and disciplined approach or not. If he is following these three things, then in that case you can use his work. So in the exam they might ask you, when internal auditor's work cannot be used. It is just the opposite of this. If he is not objective, if he does not have any competence, if he is not applying a systematic and disciplined approach, then in that case you will not use his work. Okay. So the opposite way also it can be tested. Okay. So now let us understand what is the meaning of objectivity, competence, and application of systematic and disciplined approach. So objectivity. So objectivity means the ability to perform tasks without bias, conflict of interest, undue influence of others to override your professional judgment. So that is the meaning of objectivity. So you should be able to perform your tasks without bias, without conflict of interest, without undue influence of others to override your professional judgment. Then it means that you're objective. So what are the factors while you are considering the internal auditor's objectivity? First thing, the internal audit functions organizational status should be free from bias, conflict of interest, and undue influence. So we all know that the internal audit department is within the management, or it can be outsourced by the management. So you need to make sure that the internal audit function is free from bias, conflict of interest, and undue influence. Because if it is biased and it is working for the management, it is working as the management is saying without following proper procedures, then in that case it is not objective. So you cannot rely on that work. Next, the second one is TCWG oversees employment decisions of internal audit function. So internal audit function mein you need to hire someone who is competent, who is able to carry on the work, who is having this professionalism. But if the TCWG is employing some person who is not competent, then in that case the department is not objective. So you need to check with whether the TCWG oversees the employment decisions or is completely it is only monitoring everything. So management and TCWG, if they place constraint on internal audit function, then it is not objective. Whether internal audit function is free from conflicting responsibilities, you need to check that point. Okay. So free from conflicting responsibilities, what does it mean? Internal audit function should focus on its area, that is internal audit. But if the management is giving some other responsibilities also, all other departments are giving some unnecessary work to this department, then it means that it is having conflicting responsibilities. So you should check whether the internal audit function is free from conflicting responsibilities or not. Okay, the next one is competence. So what is the meaning of competence? Competence means attainment and maintenance of knowledge and skill of the internal audit function that will enable the internal audit function to perform its task diligently and as per standards on auditing. Okay, so basically should be a competent member of ICAI. Okay, that is one point over here. See, should be a competent member of professional body, that is Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. So in this also there are some factors. First and foremost, adequately and appropriately resourced. So the internal audit function, this is an entire department and it should be adequately and appropriately resourced. Okay, now there should be established policies for hiring, training, and assigning internal auditors. Okay, there should be established policies for hiring them, training them, assigning work to them. Everything should be as per the policies. Okay, the internal auditors should have adequate technical training and proficiency in audit. Okay, they should be well trained. They should have the proficiency. They should have the professional knowledge. Internal auditors should possess required knowledge relating to financial reporting and applicable financial reporting framework. They should be a member of professional body. So all of these are the factors which determine whether you're competent or not. Next, we have application of systematic and disciplined approach. No, they didn't define what is systematic and disciplined approach. Okay, they didn't define what is a systematic and disciplined approach. They just told us that you should apply systematic and disciplined approach to these areas. So what are those areas? So you need to apply systematic and disciplined approach to planning, performing, supervising, reviewing, documenting internal auditors' activities. Are you applying a systematic and disciplined approach in planning your audit, in performing your internal audit? You are supervising, you're reviewing their work, you're documenting things. So all of these you need to check. So what are the factors which affect these? First and foremost, the internal audit procedure should be properly documented. It should match with the size and circumstance of the entity. The second one is the internal audit function should be of should have appropriate quality control procedures and policies. So these two are the factors regarding this. So what will the auditor do? He will evaluate the objectivity, the level of competence, and the application of SDA. Okay, then he can use the internal auditor's work. If all of these three are not there, or even if any one of this is not there, then in that case you will not use the internal auditor's work. Next we have determining the nature and extent. So now first you have evaluated whether you can use this work or not. Now you evaluate. Now you determine the nature and extent of the work that you can use. So while determining the nature and extent, first the external auditor will consider the nature and scope of internal audit functions work. So whatever work that they have performed or whatever work that they are planning to perform, is it relevant to your audit strategy and your audit plan? If it is relevant to your audit strategy and your audit plan, then you can use his work. Okay, so here are a few examples of work of internal audit function that can be used. So this is very important. It can be tested for 5 marks. These are basically the examples of the work of internal audit function that the external auditor can use. The first one is testing of operating effectiveness of controls. The second one is substantive procedures involving limited judgment. Observations of inventory counts, tracing transactions through information system relevant to financial reporting, testing of compliance with regulatory requirements. So these are all the 5 examples. These are a bit difficult to remember, but you have to remember. And these are the only 5 examples that are given. You can't write anything out of this. Even if you write, if it is accurate, they will give the marks. Next, circumstances where external auditor uses less work of internal audit function. So what are the cases in which external auditor is using less work of internal audit function? It's not like he is not using that work only. He is using the work, but he is using less work. So where in the external auditor's significant judgment, okay, where in his judgment to prevent undue use or less use and perform more work. See, in this case, what he's doing, he wants to prevent undue use, and he just doesn't want to take the use of it, or he wants to use less and he wants to perform more work. He himself wants to go and work more. He does not want to use the internal audit functions work, or he wants to use less and he himself only wants to go and perform more work. So in which cases he will only prefer to go and work instead of using the work of internal audit function, or he will use less work of internal audit function. So if there is more judgment involved in planning and performing audit procedures and evaluating audit evidence, then in that case the external auditor will use less work of internal audit function. If at the assertion level there is higher assessed risk of material misstatement, then in that case what will happen? He will use less work of internal audit function. Next, there is less internal audit objectivity. So there is limited support for internal auditors' objectivity, means less reliance on their work. The internal auditor is not that objective. Then in that case, you will rely less on their work. Okay. So here they are saying that there is less internal audit objectivity. They are not saying that he is not objective at all. He is less objective. Then you lose less work. Okay. Next, competence of internal audit. So there is lower internal audit competence, which leads to more direct work by external auditor. So basically, if he is not that competent, if it's not that objective, then you will use less work of him. Okay, if there is higher assessed trauma, then you will use less work. If there is more judgment involved, then also you will use less work. Okay, next. So ultimately, first you have evaluated the internal audit function. Then the second thing, you have determined the nature and extent of internal functions work. Now you are ultimately using the work of internal audit function. So if the external auditor plans to use the work of internal audit function, the external auditor shall discuss the planned use. First, he will discuss with internal auditor the planned use. Okay, this is your work and I am planning to use this in these areas. So they coordinate activities by discussing planned use with the internal audit function. Then they review internal audit reports. Reviewing internal audit reports. Understand audit procedures of internal audit function and findings by reading internal audit reports. So internal audit function, उस department के internal audit reports को पढ़कर they are reviewing the internal audit reports, on the basis of that they are using. Okay. Next, audit procedures and internal audit work. Assess adequacy of internal audit work for the audit by performing sufficient audit procedures. So you should perform audit procedures to assess the adequacy of the internal audit work as well. Now here one important thing is discussion and coordination with internal audit function should be on a timely basis. Okay, it should be an extent that covers what is the extent of audit coverage, what is the materiality. Okay, next, what are the methods, item selection or sample sizes, documentation, and reviewing and reporting procedures. So these are all the things that you will do in discussion and coordination with internal audit function. Now, this part is important. Examples where external auditor and internal auditor's coordination is effective. So when is the coordination effective? When there are regular discussion, when they are sharing information, and when the external auditors have access to all the reports of the internal auditor. Regular discussions, it means that the meetings are held regularly throughout the audit period. Information sharing, external auditor shares significant findings with internal audit function. External auditor has access to internal audit reports and he is informed about significant issues that may impact the audit. Okay, so we are done up until here. Now let us come to the next important part. This part alone can be tested in a case study or a case-based MCQ or even any question. So direct assistance is very important. So what is the meaning of direct assistance? Direct assistance refers to the use of internal auditors to perform audit procedures under the direct supervision and review of external auditors. You're using internal auditors to perform audit procedures under direct supervision and review of external auditor. Okay, so the internal auditor is under your guidance. You're using him to perform your work, but you are giving him directions, you're supervising him, and you are reviewing him. So that is the meaning of direct assistance. Next, in direct assistance, there are three main points. Determine whether internal auditors can be used to provide direct assistance for the purpose of audit, where DA is not advisable, and written agreement prior to using internal auditors to provide direct assistance. First and foremost, determine whether the internal auditors can be used. So they can be used when it is not prohibited by law or regulation. Second thing, you have to evaluate the existence and significance of any threats to objectivity and level of competence. So basically the same points, objectivity and competence. Okay. First thing, it should not be prohibited by law or regulation. Then evaluate the existence of any threat to objectivity and level of competence. Okay. Do not use the internal auditors. Do not, the internal auditors cannot be used to provide direct assistance if there are threats to objectivity and lack of sufficient competence. Same thing, opposite points. Okay. So basically you can write 2 points and you can write this point also again. Next, where DA is not advisable. What is the meaning of DA? Where direct assistance is not advisable. So in areas involving significant judgment, higher risk areas, internal auditor's previous work, and decisions about internal audit work. So in these 4 areas, direct assistance is not advisable. This is also an important point. Next, written agreement prior to using internal auditors to provide direct assistance. So before using the internal auditors to provide direct assistance, you have to obtain written agreement. From whom? First thing, you have to obtain written agreement from the authorized representative of the entity. That internal auditor will follow external auditor's instructions. See, the internal audit function of the department is within the entity. So if you're taking direct assistance from them, you need to obtain a written agreement from the authorized representative of the entity that the internal auditor will follow the external auditor's instructions. He will not follow the management's. Yeah, it means that he will follow the management's, but the entity will not intervene in the work that internal auditor performs for external auditor. Entity will not intervene again and again. Okay, so stating that you have to take a written agreement. Next, you also have to take a written agreement from the internal auditor that he will keep specific matters confidential as instructed by external auditor and inform external auditor about any threat to their objectivity. Okay, if there is any threat to the objectivity, you inform me. If there is any threat to your objectivity, you inform me and the external auditor. Okay, you keep the specific matters confidential as I instruct you. Okay, so this is about written agreements. Okay, so your entire standards is completed and the only thing that is left is internal financial control and internal control over financial reporting. Okay, so what is the meaning of internal financial control? See, always remember that internal financial control is broad, whereas internal control over financial reporting is narrow. So internal control over financial reporting are specific controls. Okay, so IFC is broader than IC over FR. Okay, so what is IFC? What is internal financial control? So when the company puts policies and procedures to ensure reliability of financial reporting, effectiveness and efficiency of operations, compliance of law and regulations, safeguarding its assets, and prevent detection, correction of fraud. When it puts policies and procedures to ensure these things, then that is internal financial control. Okay. So it's basically some policies and procedures with the company design to ensure that these things are going on smoothly. But what is internal control over financial reporting? So here, internal control over financial reporting means that the auditor expresses an opinion on effectiveness of entity's internal control over financial reporting. Okay, so this is basically effectiveness of entity's internal control over financial reporting जिस पर auditor opinion express कर रहा है. Okay. Now, which of the following is not an objective? Say, based on this concept. No, not even this. Only this concept. IFC concept they have asked in MCQ. Which of the following is not an objective of companies' policies for ensuring internal financial controls? So basically, out of these, 6 things, they have listed a few things, and they have gave some other point also, and they're telling which of the following is not company's policy. Efficient conduct of business. Yes, this is a policy that is implemented. Safeguarding of assets, prevention, detection, correction of frauds and errors, assessing audit risk. No, internal financial control has nothing to do with assessing the audit risk. So this is the wrong one. Okay. So that's it. We are done with essay number 610. So I've used small emojis here and there. Okay. So I didn't tell it in the beginning of the class. This fellow means EA. This fellow means IA. Okay. That's it.